Hello and welcome to our live Liberty Alert. I'm Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to talk about COVID-19 fatigue, its risks and our strength to move forward. At the very end, we'll talk a little bit about, obviously, the vote that's coming up next Tuesday, although I hope to have a special kind of Liberty Alert before the vote, but we'll see if that works out with a guest on our program. But I wanted to talk about this pandemic fatigue because I think it's getting real, and we've been brought kind of to the edge. And I don't know about you, but you know, my new position here, it kind of wears me out a little bit too, because I have to deal with the political stuff a lot more than I used to as a pastor. It's made me aware of the big challenges that are coming against our church. There's a political movement to silence the church. I've seen it. I've seen it in practice here on the Hill, and pushing back on that's very important. Keeping our churches free to proclaim the good news of the gospel without fear is vital. But I deal with this kind of political stuff every day, and sometimes it wears you out because there's, like we've been talking about, there really aren't political solutions to a lot of the stuff we're talking about. The solutions are going to have to come from something bigger than politics. It's going to at least come from stabilizing family, but it's more so going to come from changed hearts. And the government can't do anything about those things. And so I don't get a chance to talk about the solutions, obviously the solutions that come from the gospel in Jesus Christ much anymore, at least from the perspective of dealing with the political stuff. And I miss that because I know that's the only thing that's going to prevent us from being overwhelmed by a lot of the things that we're facing. So I thought it was important maybe to talk a little bit about this fatigue that exists today, and to talk about more than just the political answers to that for a moment, and then maybe use that as a primer for how we're going to deal with next week, whatever comes, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit more about the critical assessment of the onslaught of negative news, its effects, and how it distorts reality. It really does distort reality, and the concept of risks and dealing with risks and what it means to live life boldly in a sin-filled, broken world. We're going to see the bigger context and why that's often the hardest thing to see, especially with the kind of things we're dealing with now. What's the solution? Is it a vaccine? Is that going to be the solution? Or is there always going to be a bigger issue than just something like that? And I think that is where we're going with this discussion. And then, of course, the power of prayer, the perspective of context, and the faith to deal with life as it comes. And so, again, that's what I want to talk about today. Thanks again for tuning in. Please share this with anybody that you think really needs this information, but also share with them the fact that we've been dealing with a lot of the issues that have to deal with the COVID-19, the lockdowns, the religious liberty issues, this election, what's really at stake. We've been dealing with a lot of these issues on these live Liberty Alerts, and so you can go back and you can see the indexed titles of all of those videos, and you can share those with people. And we're getting better and better at the filming aspect of it. We've got a couple of things that I think are going to help us as we move forward. But again, the point right now is to try to get the content out as much as possible. Keep sharing these live Liberty Alerts with others. And then, of course, our webpage, lcrlfreedom.org. Go there. There's all kinds of resources there for you, and they are meant for you. They're meant for you as God's people and meant for your churches. I heard, I got an email from a gal who said, what's that group out in D.C. that's supposed to be representing our church? I haven't heard anything about them. And that I get frustrated when I get those kinds of emails because, you know, we don't know what else to do. We're live, we're producing, we're pushing things out. We're sharing these with anybody and everybody who wants to know about us. pastors, if you would share this with your people. We have bulletin blurbs, for instance. You can put a bulletin blurb, just a little paragraph, a thought for the day. We've got those up on our website. You can use those at your church, and it gets the message out of the fact that we're here in D.C. advocating for you, God's people, to keep your voice, your public voice, free, so that you can go to church without fear and without coercion. And right now, that's under attack in a lot of ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So, welcome. Great to be here with you again. Just a couple of opening thoughts about the week in review. This is finally the week where we finally will get to vote, and I think my prayer right now for you, just personally, that you don't get overwhelmed with all these things. Remember, our faith is in God, not even in government. But, my prayer is that by Wednesday of next week we'll know where we stand. And at least that will help. It could be a more dangerous place to stand from what could be coming for the church, or it could be a secure place to stand. But no matter what, we still need to be the church. And we need to be God's people for the sake of others. So this is finally the week we hope to be able to move past some of these things, or at least deal with these things in real time, because we'll at least know certain things like we don't know now. From our perspective here in Washington, this election is about religious liberty. There's one side who believes, according to their platform, that religious liberty and squelching things like religious liberty and silencing the church is part of a greater agenda. It's a more secular agenda for a more utopian kind of understanding of where we can go as people. And then there's the other side that believes that freedom of religion and freedom of assembly is what actually makes America unique and great. So we'll see how that all gets voted into place next week. We do know this: good politics, it cannot save us. So even if we get all the things that we think we're supposed to have politically, all that really does is establishes the ground floor of our civility that allows us to still be the church freely and publicly. We still need to be the church, because that is the answer to a lot of the issues that we face. So good politics, it won't save us. But bad politics, and this is the key, bad politics really can destroy. And so that's something we're trying to avoid. Amy Coney Barrett, excellent example of, again, what a conservative Christian mindset is, and how it understands law and order, and how it understands its role and vocation. I think some of the things she's written were self-explanatorily. They're excellent. You should read what she says. I mean, she has a real grasp on how to be, I think, a Christian person serving in a multi-faith land, and that's how we should be thinking. Now, again, we can even clarify more of this two-kingdom way of dealing with these things, but some of the stuff she's written has been just wonderful. And yet they still tried to defame her. They tried to besmirch her adopted children. They smeared her with dystopic references to some idiotic Netflix nonsense. They refused to vote on her credentials, and now, incredibly, some are calling for her impeachment right now. And so again, when I start to think about the politics of things, it's hard to reason with folks who go to these extremes. The kind of vitriol we're dealing with today, I'm sorry, it did not start with Donald Trump. Even the vitriol with these Supreme Court justices, who's always been vitriolic and who's been civil? This stuff goes back to the Bork hearings. It goes back to what happened to Clarence Thomas. And I remember when I watched Clarence Thomas, I kept thinking, if they can do this to him, an African-American male, if they can do this to him, they can do it to anybody. And we've just seen that play out with Kavanaugh. It didn't hit Amy Coney Barrett as much. Again, they went after her faith a bit earlier. But again, those kinds of things. So, this impeach everyone who disagrees with us kind of narrative, where did that come from? And we need to kind of tamp those things down so we can dialogue, agree where we can agree, and then agree to disagree with civility. I did love that Clarence Thomas swore, when she was sworn in, it was by Clarence Thomas. To me, that was a really good day, because I remember what I thought about when he was under attack, and his credentials. There's a good book called Clarence Thomas and the Lost Constitution. You really should read that book. It kind of sets the stage of where we are in all of this stuff, but and why our liberties are the things that are at stake. But anyway, that was this week, and hopefully by next Tuesday, God bless you. Do your research, do your homework, pray about it, and then go vote. Today, pandemic fatigue, exhaustion, it's real. In fact, there was a Wall Street Journal article that said pandemic fatigue is real and it's spreading. And this person talks about how the coronavirus is roaring back. And then, has these quotes from people talking about things like, well, I need something to look forward to. I can't be locked down anymore. I mean, this is overwhelming. And they talk about, now they didn't talk about the rise in depression. They didn't talk about the rise in suicides. They didn't talk about any of those things, which is what I thought this article was going to talk about. But the title is right. There is pandemic fatigue. And there's even talk now about locking countries down again. And what's interesting is whenever you read these articles, you've got to ask the question, what is the main question of this article? And I think after having read this, the question has to do with, the need for lockdowns again and the need for community, as if that's the only real issue. The question I have, even from this article, is were the lockdowns actually successful? And everyone says, of course they were. Well, actually, there's a lot of doctors right now saying all they're really doing is prolonging the rate of us being infected by this disease, because you can't stop the virus. So the lockdowns aren't stopping the virus. And so when people start coming out of their houses again, and then there's going to be an uptick in these kind of things, because herd immunity is the only solution to this virus. And what I mean by that is you can get to herd immunity through therapeutics, you can get to herd immunity through vaccine, or you get to herd immunity through everyone being infected and then developing antibodies to this thing. But eventually it's herd immunity that weakens the virus, and actually the viral strength finally now is mitigated, and we can go on with living until the next pandemic kind of thing. That's the truth. I mean, that's the science. And so the idea of locking us all up and it will make the thing go away, that actually is not scientific at all. That just means, that's kind of like price controls. When someone said, well, everything's rising and that's bad, so let's just say the price will always be $1 for a hamburger, or 50 cents for gasoline. Well, if you remember, and Richard Nixon did this, by the way, so it's a Republican who did this back in the 70s. If you remember what happened, all the stuff we needed suddenly was gone, and there were people saying there was no more oil because we just decided to set a price, and that was the price. Well, it didn't make sense for people to bring that oil to market anymore, and suddenly there was a crisis. There was no oil. There was tons of oil. It's just that deciding what the price should be by government fiat destroyed the capacity of people to bring it to market. It's kind of the similar thing about locking down. You can just say, well, we're going to lock down and that's going to solve it. No, the virus has other ideas. It's going to hang around and it's going to wait until people start coming out again. Herd immunity is what finally will solve this, and therapeutics will get us there, a vaccine will get us there, or asymptomatic people who get the virus and start to resist it will get us there. And that's the real struggle, is that there's no easy solution to this. So the first thing that bothered me was they almost made it like, it's coming back. Well, we knew that we were just trying to make sure that the hospitals weren't overwhelmed, and we wanted to make sure we were developing therapeutics and maybe a vaccine to start to mitigate these things. And then we began to find out that it wasn't as virulent as we thought it was. So again, all this information, and instead of bringing all that to bear on this article, they just pit, should we lock down again, or can people survive it? And to me, that's kind of a false notion too. So after a while, I was like, well, however you frame the question, you're going to get the answer that you want. So again, this person said it's a matter of balance. We really need to come up with new rules, but then make sure that people can accept these rules. Well, that's a bureaucrat talking. That's a government official talking. A lot of us are saying, no, give us the information. Let us critically think through this information, and then we'll decide how to manage the risks of living our lives, running our businesses, providing for our families. We don't need a government official deciding all of these kind of questions from afar. It's really kind of interesting because this fatigue thing, this fear of the virus, fear of the loss of the job, fear of confinement, fear of lockdowns, all those are real fears. The question is who gets to manage those fears? Who gets to make decisions about those fears? So they talked about, problems begin when the rules run up against the need for social connection. Problem is also who gets to make the rules, and in America, they were quoting people in Europe, and they were quoting people from Western Europe. See, they think differently than we do. We're like, no, the government doesn't get to make rules about what we do with our lives in general. I've always been shocked by people who think that if the government starts making the rules to your life, that somehow you're going to have a better life. It's much better to live a virtuous life by faith, for your family, for church, and for your community. That's much better than to have someone telling you how you're going to live your life. And so fundamentally, our culture is more about the freedom to live your life and to deal with the issues that are coming. So they talked about this thing, how do we resolve this thing? How do we deal with this? And the whole point of the article was there's real fatigue setting in. I agree with that. I agree with the fact that there's real fatigue setting in. And when you start to think about the kind of people in charge who actually, maybe they care more about their own power than they care about whether or not you have what you need, then the fears can be multiplied. So for me, I guess when I read through this article, the first thing that hit me is who's the best at mitigating the risks and the fears of my life? Why is there a First Amendment? Does it apply for a time like this? And is faith more important than all this? So, again, when we look at these things, keeping up with the rules and making sure that you understand the rules, in some sense, that was kind of like, okay, that'll help you with your fears. I don't know if that was a good solution. But she pointed out very, matter of factly, yeah, there's a real pandemic of fear. And I think that's true. I read another article that talked about the fears that are now manifesting themselves in depression, suicides, people not taking care of themselves, obesity, all these kind of things are happening. And of course, they make a difference on whether or not we live or die or whether we live in fear. Now, it's interesting. I've experienced this kind of firsthand. My job now my work takes me all around the country, even now. And so I've seen it. I've seen both coasts, how they're handling things. I've seen the Midwest, how it's handling things. I talked about that one group where I spoke, where they assessed the fears, and if people didn't want to come to the event, then they could do it virtually. But other people who wanted to come to the event, then they gave them the 3 different ways of dealing with their own fears at the moment. One was to wear a red band if they were still kind of afraid and they wanted to maintain not only social distance, but real distance. Yellow, you could talk, converse. They didn't mind the 6 foot and just kind of hang in there. And then, of course, the green, which was, no, we've assessed the risks and we want to get back to some kind of normalcy. I just thought that was an excellent way of mitigating and managing the fear because it allowed people to make those decisions, which prevented us from looking at everybody as some kind of carrier of the bubonic plague. So that was one thing. But then I went to another place and literally locked down, people afraid. If you went outside with a mask on, you almost felt like the police were watching to see if they could come and give you a fine. And I thought, this isn't right. Not for the level of the ability of this virus, that it's wreaking havoc and it's making people sick, but the rate that it's taking people's lives compared to what we were told it was going to do, this is in some sense way much more of an overreaction. And now we were told that we just needed to make sure we kept the hospitals from being overrun. Now we're saying we have to stop all infections. Well, that's virtually impossible. So lockdown until we have no infections? I don't see how we can survive that. So again, when we think these things through, we had a St. Louis experience, I think I told you this, where we went to a concert outside in downtown St. Louis and truly felt like we were being treated Like the people that were manning the gates were like Nazi Gestapo guards, because they put us in little pods, and if you got outside the pods, someone came and kind of, took, did the proverbial switch on the fingers and said, no, 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 you stay in your pod. And then you had to walk a certain way to the bathrooms, and you had to walk a certain way back, and you had to walk in single file, and no, 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 no. And this was outdoors. This was outdoors. And the next night we went to another place in St. Louis County where, we wore a mask, social distance, hygiene, all the things that I know we should be doing. But we were allowed to sit at our table with our friends and enjoy a nice and neat out. The place was relatively packed. It wasn't, like it always is with shoulder to shoulder, but, the proper distancing and all the things were being practiced, and people had a wonderful time. And it was outdoors. So again, we start to think, who can enforce these kind of capricious rules on us? And then, of course, I just did Reformation this weekend and a Liberty lecture. And this is the first time I really got a chance to participate in preaching amidst the pandemic and offering the Lord's Supper. I know what you pastors are up against. Man, when I saw us all putting on gloves and masking up and facial, and almost like we were dealing with radioactive material. And when I preached, I couldn't see any of the faces because everybody had their faces covered, and I thought, wow, is this where we're going? and again, isn't there a better way to handle our fears than this? So one of the things I asked when I was talking to the pastor, I said, well, because this church was kind of out of ways too. It wasn't really in like an urban area where lots of people around. And it was like, well, no, we participate in the rules of the city. And, they've kind of threatened that if they see too many cars or whatever, they might come by and just check. And if the chairs aren't a certain way or whatever, we could be fined. No matter if we're doing all the other stuff. And I just thought, this just isn't right. So, there's fatigue, and it's setting in because people are afraid. And the question is, how do we deal with these fears? And is the government the only one who can come up with good solutions? Now, the thing that I've also seen is the pandemic punishment and the shame that's real too. So when you talk about, the plans that I don't understand why we can't kind of deal with some of these things on our own. In fact, a lot of people complain that President Trump didn't have a plan. Well, I've read on this stuff from day one. I know what his plan is. His plan was to decentralize most of the critical decisions to the governors because they're the ones who are dealing with the issues in their states. And you can't come up with a federal one-size-fits-all thing because New York is different than Montana, which is different than Nebraska, which is different than Florida. And so there's all kinds of geographic issues. There was all kinds of urban density issues. Well, that's better than for state by state and governor by governor. And the federal government was to supply whatever the states needed. That was a great plan. And I still think it is. Of course, whenever you decentralize a solution, you get criticized if something goes wrong, if people don't take responsibility for the decisions they make. We saw a lot of that kind of stuff. But when we think about that, then making sure that people from Wuhan and those places could not come into our country as soon as that issue was uncovered. I thought that was great. And this was, remember, at a time when a lot of people were saying this was not going to be a big deal. This was not going to be an issue. This was not going to be, in fact, I think Fauci said that early on. And then the whole thing about masks, not masks. One time the government was telling us and the scientists were telling us the masks were superfluous. And there's still scientists saying some of that. And then there are others saying, well, they absolutely work. Well, the question is to what end and to what good, because certain masks work for certain things and they don't work for others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the whole point was decentralize, localize, make sure that all the resources that are needed, and then was therapeutics, try to get everybody, kind of ramped up to try to come up with therapeutics as best as possible, and then a vaccine, and then ultimately so that herd immunity could finally take place and we could get past some of this. And there are some doctors that are saying that if you lock people back down, all you do is extend the rate of infection time. You don't solve the crisis. It's kind of like I said, like a price controls or some of the things that made the the Great Depression longer. You know, they thought they were doing something good. They actually made things even worse. So there's some debate on that too. I've signed a document. You know, you can look at it. It's called the Great Barrington Declaration, and it was signed by. There's 3 physicians who started this. Now, this is my opinion. You know, you can disagree with this. There are doctors who disagree with this too, but there's a lot of doctors who are co-signers. Martin Kulldorff, the professor of medicine at Harvard University, a biostatistician, epidemiologist. Dr. Gupta, professor at Oxford University, epidemiologist. And Jay Bhattacharya, professor at Stanford University, medical physician, epidemiologist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a bunch of co-signers from physicians. And so you can look up the document, but the gist of it is this. They said, you know, when we talk about this, they called their recommended approach focused protection. And so they said, we've got doctors from the left and the right, and the current lockdown policies are producing devastating effects on short and long-term public health. The results include lower child vaccination rates, worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes, fewer cancer screenings, deteriorating mental health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keeping students out of school is a grave injustice. And then they talk about the virus. They talk about the science behind the virus, that it literally is, that children are actually more susceptible to problems with influenza than with COVID-19. They should be back in school. But knowing that is the case, they talk about strategies to protect those who are vulnerable, and they have to do more with senior citizens, people in nursing homes, people who are older, post 60, and I'm in that range now, who have mitigating circumstances with health, those kind of things, and finding ways to care for them, isolate them without putting them in isolation, and then actually get to the point of herd immunity through therapeutics or even a vaccine. I just thought this was such a balanced approach because what it's really saying is, who gets to mitigate the risks? Who gets to assess the risks? Who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to decide the issue of living my life and loving my neighbor? Well, you do. And we want you to do it virtuously. We want you to do it with information, and we want you to do it honoring God and serving neighbor. Yeah, but there's definitive principles that are at work here. You can, you know, I was telling people, you can have a definitive principle and come up with a different application. So you and I could both say, I'm the one who's supposed to make some of those kind of decisions. I'm the one who's supposed to mitigate risk, and yet we could come up with different strategies how to attack this or how to go about living our lives, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have that view versus, no, the government is going to make all these decisions for you, that's where I disagree. And that's where a lot of the problems are ensuing. When government officials start making these decisions for us and then using fear tactics to tell us, you know, that we'll either abide by their rules or we'll be punished. So, you know, the pandemic punishment and shame issue is a real problem. When you can have the Nevada casinos, the liquor stores, and the Walmarts open, but the church is closed. When you can have John MacArthur's church, I don't know if you're following this in California. This is what they're doing. John MacArthur's church, big church, but they've honored the 10%. They only have 10% of their people come to any particular church service. They practice social distancing, hygiene, washing, masks, multiple services, and they clean the whole place after each service. They practice all of that. And yet the governor is now, they've got $700,000 worth of fines because the governor has decided that they need to be shut down, or they need to actually be punished even more, to have more restrictions put on them than other businesses. Again, the reason why this is so huge is because the churches are First Amendment organizations. They're not just businesses. They're First Amendment organizations, and a lot of these governors and mayors are saying, you know, the church is a secondary institution. We can't let them get away with that. That's what the First Amendment's all about. Now, how to open up and how to actually open up your church, please work with your pastors, work with your church councils, work with your circuits, come up with a reasonable plan based on the area in which you live, those kind of things. And please, folks, will you pray for your pastors? Because they're dealing with people who are fearful. They're dealing with people who are unafraid for the right reasons and the wrong reasons. They're people who are fearful for the right reasons and the wrong reasons. And they've got to be pastoral to all of you. So please pray for them. But let's not create an institutional fear of these kind of things, because it's just not warranted. So I think the berating has to end. I've heard of church services that are opened up and the neighbors have been vitriolic to them because they think somehow they're super spreaders, and then you go, what is a super spreader of a virus that's going to spread? And, are we mitigating the risks well? So the limits of science, one of the things that I've talked about in a lot of these issues is there are limits to science. Okay, there are limits to science. Even this Barrington Declaration, there are people who disagree with this. I get that. And so there are limits to what science can actually tell us. I feel like we've become a culture that just thinks science is going to tell us all the answers, and there's going to be no personal struggle. There's going to be no personal taking responsibility. We just, whatever the science says, we do it. We know when the President of the United States or the one who's running for the president says, whatever a doctor tells me, I'm just going to do that. No. You have to manage the risks as the President of the United States for all of us, for our businesses, for our families, for our churches, as well as with the challenge of this pandemic. And by the way, where did this pandemic come from? Why is it not acting like a flu? Why is it acting like something that's not natural? We should know this kind of stuff too. Maybe, we're seeing something, the potential biological warfare, we're starting to see little glimpses of that too. Who knows? That's the job of the president. The job of my family is for we to get the best information, mitigate those fears, because the reality is science cannot solve the question of fear. In fact, science creates a lot of fear too, by what it can do and what we tell it shouldn't do. So science can't tell us the morality of dealing with competing risks. That's why those decisions are left to your faith and your conscience. And so all these TV shows where, it just says the DNA says this, so get them, or the fingerprint says that. Do you know that there's an art even to DNA? There's an art even to, there's obviously an art to fingerprints and things like that. So this idea that it's just so simple. It's so simple. Talk to people who are in forensics. They'll tell you it's not that simple. And by the way, like I've said before, science can tell you that something is, but it can't tell you whether you should. Should we be messing around with genetics to the point where we can have designer babies, or should we not? There's all kinds of questions about what we're meddling with these kind of things. I've even heard that there is a report that some of the potential vaccines might be using fetal tissue. If that's the case, that's a real problem, because you might get to a solution, but then you've created a very disastrous, morbid, and destructive way of doing that. And I always loved George Bush when he talked about stem cells. He said, we'll keep using the stem cells we have since that's what we have already, but we're not going to create more fetal stem cells for research, because that would create a business of killing children, and we can't do that. That was a great nuanced answer. Okay, we'll keep using these because we have them, and they can go on for unlimited time, but we're not going to create an industry that destroys human life to get this. Beautiful stuff, but of course that's a tough answer to a question that was posed to him. And again, just thinking these things through and dealing with the reality, the moral reality of some of these things. It's bigger than the science. The science can tell you that. So that pandemic punishment is built on this notion that science already told us, and this is what we must do, and if you don't do it, we're coming after you. We've got to be more kind to one another than that, because there's more information out there than that simplistic notion of it doesn't really matter, or it matters, so you better do this, and that's the only solution. And then finally, the pandemic's purpose. One of the things that I want us to start seeing as a church in the middle of all this, there's a purpose through going through these things. Just like there's a purpose of getting involved in people's lives if their lives are a mess. You get involved in their life, and sometimes it's a struggle because you're not sure how you'll handle if you're kind of part of that struggle too. God's people need to learn how to jump into some of the disasters of the world in which we live, because we have a message for a moment like this. And I think the pandemic's purpose, if it's anything, is that government cannot solve these things. It's a power structure. It's not a service structure. And so if you start putting your hopes that the government will save or the government will be benevolent or no, it won't. The Great Society was all built on that notion that we can take the place of the family, we can take the place of your job, we can take the place of all this stuff and have this utopian future. And it's really destroying parts of our culture today, to the point where I don't think it's going to be something easy as just rolling all that back, because we've got generations now who think that mom and dad are not their providers or their disciplinarians or their authority figures. They're looking elsewhere than that. You can't just flip the switch and turn that around. But you've also got to start moving in that direction again, or all you're going to have is more and more and more misery. So pandemic, government can't solve these things. It wasn't meant to. When I look at the research of the pandemic, sometimes they emphasize this and they forget to emphasize that. There is some good news right now. Yeah, it's good news. I don't hear much about it. Maybe that's because there's a politics to this too. I don't want to get into that. But the goal is to try to come up with the best information and then us deal with the risks and getting about living our lives. So if you understand the difference between government and free societies, especially the freest society, the church, and you understand how we differentiate those two, then you'll begin to understand we want to find solutions over here, not over here. And that's, I think, what we're dealing with right now. And I don't know if there's a vested interest in keeping people in fear, but it seems like prolonging it is part of some kind of equation. So government's always a coercive body. It's led by sinful people. It's the only place where absolute power can rest. And so it's got to be checked by people of conscience. It's got to be checked by people who are morally that we're informed and we're in virtuous citizenship. And our role is for us to make the decisions about these kinds of issues going forward. So I think if there's any purpose, we're starting to see we have a responsibility to live our life in the face of a lot of risks. Now, maybe you were already doing that, but some people, they thought that that these kind of things should be taken care of. Well, they're realizing now that the government doesn't do a very good job of taking care of these things, especially when they start to fight for political advantage. So there's got to be more than government solutions for these problems, which is why we're fighting to keep, these nefarious government inreaches at bay. But the church is an essential organization. We're learning that we're going to have to fight for that. We're also learning that if suddenly you can take our ability to worship away, our ability to be in community away, our ability to actually receive the word and the sacraments in community, that will have devastating effects to the soul of a people and the soul of a nation. And then finally, there is more to life. I mean, okay, let's say there's a solution to this tomorrow, at least there's a vaccine tomorrow. The fear that got us to this point, that solution is not going to mitigate that fear. The people who kind of deal in fear and the politicization of fear, they start to realize, wow, that fear can get them to do whatever we want. That's a danger right now. And so I'm asking you right now, even in the middle of your fear, prioritize in your hearts and minds, prioritize that God is at work in the world. That's number one. And start every day with that knowledge. God is at work. Prioritize then your faith, your family, your church, and your community. And rededicate yourself to the people and the structures that are closest to you. And I think you're going to find that some of these fears then abate, although they're not going to let these things go that easily. So faith in God and the eternal freedom that comes by faith, that's what life is all about. And I've been experiencing this stuff firsthand all around the country, and I'm telling you, that's the one solution we have that is beyond politics, and we can't let politics take that away from us or silence that. Not just in our church communities, but in our communities as well. So, a couple of things then. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? I would just say this. As God's people, besides the social distancing and the hygiene and the masks, and I'm okay with that if they're reasonable. I'm okay with that. But be kind to one another. In the middle of all this stuff, the hardest thing right now is we're dealing with anger. It's almost like road rage. It's almost like pandemic fear, but then pandemic rage, and we're dealing with all that. And I think it's not justifiable, but there's a sense where we've got to model a different way of strength And kindness is also built on strength. Some people are afraid for good reasons. Other people are afraid for the wrong reasons. Other people are unafraid for the wrong reasons. And other people are unafraid for the right reasons. So again, be kind in the middle of that. Also help your pastors with this, because they're managing all those kind of fears in our communities. Seek to calm the fears that people have, not through government action or inaction or the definitive word of doctors, because you're going to find, even this document that I appreciate, there are doctors who say no. And so, it's not ultimately a doctor who's going to even determine my physical and spiritual life. It's going to be another word. And that word is one that comes through the word and the sacraments, especially the voice of God's church. Seek to get back to church if you're able. Find a way. Okay? Pray for your pastor, pray for your people, pray for your neighborhood, pray for those who are afraid, and pray for those who are unafraid, so that we, find a way to actually care about each other. Even if you're afraid, you still need to learn how to try to care for others, not just be afraid and live in fear. We bring our fears to the Lord so that we can even be useful in His hands to other people. So maybe your fears are driving you even closer to Christ, so that you can deal with someone who has fears, who don't know who Jesus is. But don't be so locked in your fear that you forget God is at work and you are still God's child. You live in freedom. You live in victory right now in this time and place. So the only other thing I would say, unfortunately, is get ready. Get ready for government intrusion to actually still be a part of even post-election. I'm not sure. I mean, if certain folks win, I think they'll protect our religious liberties for a time again. If another party wins, I think there's going to be real challenges to our religious liberty. But no matter what, we need to be prepared to be the church. Now, again, I'll post these articles on our website so you can read them. And I think you can find the Great Barrington Declaration if you just Google that as well. But let me close with this final thought about the election. The election that's coming up, vote platform, not people. I mean, that's my best advice. We've been talking about this for quite a while. Religious liberty and the right of conscience, and they're fundamental to a free society, and they are on the ballot this year. So I wish they weren't, but they are. Pro-life, pro-family, pro-neighborhood, pro-educational freedom. When people say that Christians are only one issue voters, I think that's silly. We've got a platform that we aspire to, because it's a platform that empowers people, even people with whom we disagree, by the way. So if I'm talking about pro-educational freedom, I'm talking about educational choice that can lift people out of poverty, that can give people a good education, that can actually help them get out of the tougher neighborhoods and actually be a part of the American dream, because education is that important. Well, people are stripping them of that choice. Pro-small business. Moms and dads should be free to start their own businesses, to take care of their families freely without so much coercion from government oversight. And if you've ever tried to start a small business, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then charity should first start in the home, then through the church and in the neighborhood. It should be freely received and freely given. And the higher taxes has nothing to do with benevolence. Coercive giving has nothing to do with benevolence. It is not a biblical notion. Jesus never said anything of the sort. So again, I want charity. Absolutely. I want us to be charitable people. I want us to be giving of our time, talent, and treasure. All of those different things. So again, just differentiating the role of free associations versus government coercion. So that's a platform. That's kind of a platform I'm voting on. The only question for me is, I'm still not going to put my hope in princes or princesses or kings and queens. And even if the right people get elected this time around, we've still got a life to live in Christ for others. So till next time, God richly bless you. Be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and be about the Lord's business. Try to be useful in His hands. Differentiate His preserving work from His saving work, but be at work for the sake of others. God bless you. Have a great day.